The summer heat of 1975 hung thick inside CBGB, the kind of oppressive warmth that made leather jackets stick to skin and amplified the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke that had soaked into every surface of the Bowery Club. Lou Reed stood near the bar, his trademark dark sunglasses hiding eyes that had seen too much, done too much, survived too much. At 33, he was already considered a relic by some of the younger crowd pushing their way through the narrow club. Kids who didn't remember the Velvet Underground's first shows, who hadn't lived through the factory years with Andy Warhol. But that night, something was about to happen that would expose the raw nerve of generational conflict in punk rock. A confrontation that witnesses would whisper about for decades, but that would never make it into official rock history. Because what happened in that cramped bathroom hallway at CBGB wasn't just an argument between two artists. It was a collision between the past and future of rock poetry, between the man who had broken every rule and the woman who was using his blueprint to build something new. If you want to discover the untold stories of rock's most controversial poets, subscribe to our channel now. We bring you the moments that changed music history forever. Lou Reed had come to CBGB that night, with a chip on his shoulder the size of Manhattan. His latest album, Metal Machine Music, had been a spectacular disaster. A double album of guitar feedback and noise that had alienated fans, enraged critics, and nearly destroyed what remained of his commercial viability. The rock press had crucified him. Record stores were accepting returns. His label was threatening legal action. For an artist who had always prided himself on being ahead of the curve, on being the dangerous one, the untouchable one, the rejection stung deeper than he would ever admit. He had spent the afternoon drinking at Max's Kansas City, his old stomping ground, listening to former associates whisper about his decline, about how the Velvet Underground's legacy was being squandered by his increasingly erratic behavior. By the time he arrived at CBGB, Reed was looking for a fight, though he didn't know it yet. He was looking for someone to blame for the fact that the world had moved on, that new voices were rising from the same underground he had helped create. Patti Smith was 28 that summer, and she was on fire. Her debut album, Horses, wouldn't be released until November, but the buzz around her was electric, dangerous, real. She had been performing at CBGB regularly, her poetry-infused performances drawing crowds that were younger, hungrier, and more idealistic than the jaded scenesters who had populated the clubs in Reed's heyday. Smith worshipped the same literary gods as Reed, drew from the same well of Rimbaud and Burroughs and Genet, but she was doing something different with it, something that felt both ancient and utterly contemporary. She was fearless in ways that Reed had once been, before the heroin and the electroshock therapy and the endless betrayals had taught him to armor himself in irony and cruelty. That night, she had just finished a blistering set, her band still packing up their gear, and she was riding the high of performance. That particular euphoria that comes from connecting with an audience, from feeling the power of words and music coursing through your body and out into the world. The confrontation began innocuously enough. Reed had watched part of Smith's set from the back of the club, his face unreadable behind those dark glasses. Those who noticed him said he seemed agitated, chain-smoking and drinking straight vodka, occasionally muttering comments to whoever was unfortunate enough to be standing nearby. When Smith came off stage, flushed with triumph and surrounded by admirers, she made her way toward the bathroom, needing a moment alone to come down from the adrenaline rush. Reed intercepted her in the narrow hallway, that claustrophobic corridor where the bathrooms reeked of chemical cleaner fighting a losing battle against decades of rock and roll excess. What he said first, according to those close enough to hear, was almost casual, almost friendly. Almost. He told her she had done well, that her poetry had potential, that she clearly understood the tradition she was working in. But then came the knife, delivered with that particular Lou Reed combination of intellectual superiority and personal venom. He told her that what she was doing was derivative, that she was just recycling ideas he and others had pioneered a decade earlier, that her rebellion was second-hand, borrowed, safe. Smith's response was immediate and devastating. She had spent years developing her voice, fighting to be taken seriously in a male-dominated scene, refusing to soften her edges or play by anyone's rules. She wasn't about to be dismissed by a man she had once idolized, a man whose work had helped shape her artistic consciousness. According to witnesses, she stepped closer to Reed, invading his space in that tight hallway, and her voice dropped to a fierce whisper that somehow carried more threat than shouting would have. She told him that his time was over, that he was a relic clinging to past glories, that metal machine music wasn't avant-garde genius, but the desperate act of an artist who had lost touch with why people loved music in the first place. She called him burned out, washed up, a cautionary tale. And then she went further, touching the nerve she somehow knew would hurt most. She told him he was scared, that he was threatened by her because she represented everything he had once been but could never be again. Young, vital, uncompromising, real. The escalation that followed would define the relationship between punk's founding father and its emerging queen. Reed's face went pale, witnesses later recalled, and for a moment the hallway seemed to hold its breath. The man, who had written songs about heroin and transgender lovers, who had survived Andy Warhol's manipulation and the music industry's contempt, who had endured electroshock therapy meant to cure his sexuality, now stood face to face with a woman who refused to show him the deference he believed he deserved. His response was pure Lou Reed, calculated to wound. He told Smith she was nothing but a cheap copy, a pale imitation playing dress-up in borrowed clothes. He said her poetry was pretentious garbage, that she hid behind literary references because she didn't have any real ideas of her own. And then he went for the jugular, attacking her appearance, her gender, suggesting that she only got attention because the scene was desperate for a female figurehead, that her success was novelty, not talent. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Several people nearby moved away, sensing the situation was about to explode. One club regular, a photographer who had documented the CBGB scene for years, later said the hatred on both their faces was terrifying, that it felt less like an argument and more like two animals fighting for territory, for survival, for the right to define what punk rock would become. Smith didn't back down. Instead, she laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the tension like a razor. She told Reed that his insults proved her point, that he was so insecure about his fading relevance, that he needed to tear down anyone who threatened his mythology. She said the difference between them was simple. She was building something new while he was desperately trying to protect something dead. She told him that history would remember the Velvet Underground as groundbreaking and remember him as the man who squandered that legacy with his ego and his addictions and his pathetic need to remain shocking when he had nothing shocking left to say. And then, in a move that stunned everyone present, she told him he should have stayed gone after the Velvet Underground broke up, that every album he had made since was just him desperately trying to prove he was still dangerous when everyone could see he was just damaged. The physical confrontation almost happened. Reed grabbed Smith's arm, not violently but firmly enough that she had to wrench it away. He moved closer, his face inches from hers, and for a moment it seemed like the situation would dissolve into actual violence. But Smith held her ground, her eyes locked on his, refusing to show fear or retreat. Several of her band members and friends started moving toward them, while Hilly Crystal, CBGB's owner, began pushing through the crowd, sensing disaster. The standoff lasted only seconds, but felt eternal to those watching. Finally, Reed stepped back, a sneer on his face, and delivered his parting shot. He told Smith she was nothing, that in 5 years no one would remember her name, that she was just another wannabe who would be forgotten as soon as the next trend came along. Then he turned and walked out of the club, pushing past the crowd, leaving Smith standing in that dingy hallway, shaking with rage and adrenaline. What happened after that night would prove that both artists were right and both were wrong. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Smith's friends surrounded her, asking if she was okay, reliving what they had just witnessed. Some wanted to go after Reed to defend her honor, but Smith stopped them. She was quiet for a long moment, her hands still trembling, and then she made a decision that showed the difference between her and Reed more clearly than any words could. She went back out onto the floor of CBGB and started talking to the people who had seen the confrontation. Not defending herself or attacking Reed, but engaging with the ideas behind their conflict. She talked about artistic evolution, about the responsibility of influence, about how every generation has to kill its fathers to create something new. She turned the ugliness of the confrontation into a teaching moment, a meditation on creativity and legacy and the violence inherent in the artistic process. Reed, meanwhile, disappeared into the night, ending up at another bar, then another, drinking until the confrontation blurred into the general haze of rage and disappointment that characterized his life in 1975. Friends who saw him in the following days said he was obsessed with the incident, bringing it up repeatedly, alternating between dismissing Smith as irrelevant and ranting about her disrespect, her ingratitude for the path he had paved. He told one associate that Smith was dangerous, not because of her talent, but because she represented a new generation that didn't care about the old rules, the old hierarchies, the old debts. He recognized in her the same refusal to compromise that had defined his own early career, and it terrified him because it meant his time as the voice of the underground was truly over. The deeper truth about that confrontation, the truth that neither artist would acknowledge for years, was that they were more alike than different. Both had been damaged by their families, by systems that tried to force them into acceptable shapes. Reed had his electroshock therapy. Smith had her strict Jehovah's Witness upbringing and the suffocating expectations of working-class New Jersey. Both had fled to New York seeking freedom and found scenes that were simultaneously liberating and exploitative. Both used poetry and rock and roll as weapons against a world that wanted them silent and compliant. Both understood that art could be a form of survival, a way of transforming pain into power. But where Reed had learned to protect himself through distance and irony and cruelty, Smith had maintained a kind of earnest vulnerability, a willingness to believe in the transformative power of art that Reed had lost somewhere between his first album and his 10th. The CBGB confrontation was never reported in the music press at the time. This was before the era of TMZ and social media, when confrontations between artists could remain private, relegated to whispered stories and second-hand accounts. A few people mentioned it in later interviews, always carefully, always with the caveat that memories of that era were fuzzy, that everyone was high or drunk or both, that the details might not be exactly right. but the basic facts remained consistent. Reed and Smith had a brutal argument in the bathroom hallway of CBGB in the summer of 1975. Reed had attacked Smith's originality and talent. Smith had attacked Reed's relevance and legacy. Both had drawn blood, and both had walked away from the encounter changed in ways they wouldn't understand for years. The long-term consequences of that night rippled through both of their careers in unexpected ways. Smith's album Horses came out in November 1975 and was immediately recognized as a masterpiece, a perfect fusion of poetry and punk rock that proved she was exactly what she claimed to be, an original voice building on the past, while creating something entirely new. Critics who reviewed the album often mentioned the Velvet Underground as an influence, drawing the direct line between Reed's work and Smith's, but always making clear that Smith had taken those influences and transformed them into something that belonged entirely to her. The album's success must have stung Reed, proof that Smith wasn't a flash in the pan or a novelty act, but a legitimate artist with staying power. In interviews promoting the album, Smith was asked about Reed's influence, and she always gave him credit, always acknowledged the debt, but she never mentioned their confrontation, never gave any hint of the animosity between them. Reed, struggling through the disaster of Metal Machine music, watched Smith's ascent with what friends described as a mixture of resentment and grudging respect. He never publicly acknowledged their fight, never spoke about Smith in interviews during this period, a silence that spoke volumes for an artist who rarely hesitated to attack his perceived enemies. But the confrontation seemed to have planted something in his mind, a recognition that his current path was leading nowhere, that he needed to find a way forward that didn't depend on past glories or shock tactics. His next album, Coney Island Baby, released in early 1976, was a return to more traditional songwriting, vulnerable in ways Reed hadn't allowed himself to be in years. The title track, with its confession of failed dreams and desperate hope, felt like a direct response to Smith's accusation that he had nothing left to say, that he was just recycling old provocations. The two artists orbited each other carefully for the next several years, both fixtures of the New York scene but moving in different circles, performing at different venues, maintaining a cold distance that everyone who knew the story understood, but no one discussed openly. When they did encounter each other at parties or shows, witnesses reported a frosty politeness, brief nods of acknowledgement that contained oceans of unspoken history. Smith's star continued to rise through the late 70s with albums like Radio Ethiopia and Easter, while Reed rebuilt his career slowly, methodically, creating some of his most enduring work in albums like The Bells and Growing Up in Public. They were both proving that they could survive, that they could evolve, that the confrontation at CBGB had been a moment of crisis that pushed them both toward necessary changes. The reconciliation came 20 years later. In 1995, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted the Velvet Underground, and Smith was chosen to give the induction speech. She crafted words that were both deeply personal and historically important, acknowledging her debt to their groundbreaking work. When she reached the part about Reed specifically, her voice caught for just a moment. She talked about his courage, his refusal to compromise, his willingness to write about subjects that terrified other artists. And then she said something that felt like the closing of a circle. She said that Reed had taught her that being an artist meant being willing to be misunderstood, to be attacked, to be alone. Reed's response that night was revealing. He accepted the award with rare graciousness, thanking Smith specifically, acknowledging her importance in a way he had never done publicly before. Backstage, the two artists spoke briefly, awkwardly, but with genuine warmth. They didn't rehash the CBGB confrontation. Instead, they talked about music, about poetry, about the changing landscape of rock and roll. It wasn't a Hollywood ending, but it was something more valuable. It was two warriors recognizing that there had always been room for both of them. The legacy of that bathroom hallway confrontation extends far beyond the two people involved. The CBGB fight between Reed and Smith encapsulated a tension that exists in every artistic movement. The conflict between preservation and evolution, between honoring influence and transcending it, between the generation that breaks the rules and the generation that uses those broken rules to break new ones. Reed's fear that he was being replaced was real and legitimate, just as Smith's anger at being dismissed was justified and necessary. Neither was entirely right. Neither was entirely wrong. They were both casualties and beneficiaries of the same relentless process by which art evolves, by which the radical becomes conventional, by which today's revolutionary becomes tomorrow's establishment. For Reed, the confrontation was a wake-up call that his strategy of constant provocation and antagonism had a shelf life, that shock tactics couldn't sustain a career forever. The humiliation of being called irrelevant by someone he had influenced forced him to confront the fact that influence alone doesn't guarantee continued relevance, that every artist must constantly reinvent themselves or face obsolescence. The work he produced in the years following 1975 showed a newfound willingness to be vulnerable, to explore emotional territory beyond the cool detachment that had characterized much of his earlier work. Songs like Coney Island Baby and Street Hassle contained a rawness and honesty that felt earned, that came from a place of genuine self-examination rather than calculated provocation. For Smith, the confrontation confirmed what she already suspected, that the old guard would not hand over the crown willingly, that she would have to take her place in rock history through force of talent and will rather than receiving it as a gift from previous generations. Reed's attacks, meant to diminish her, instead strengthened her resolve to prove herself on her own terms. The success of Horses and her subsequent albums validated her vision, demonstrated that she wasn't just copying the past, but building on it to create something new. She had learned from Reed's example, both his triumphs and his failures, using that knowledge to navigate the music industry with a shrewdness that protected her artistic integrity while avoiding the self-destructive tendencies that had nearly destroyed Reed multiple times. The bathroom hallway at CBGB where they fought has long since been renovated, the club itself closing in 2006, but the memory of that confrontation lives on in the oral history of punk rock, passed down from those who were there to younger generations who understand its symbolic importance. It represents the moment when punk rock, barely born, already faced its first generational conflict, already had to grapple with questions of authenticity and ownership and evolution that would define it for decades to come. Every punk band that forms today, whether they know it or not, exists in the space created by that fight, in the tension between honoring the past and destroying it, between gratitude and rebellion, between influence and independence. In the end, both artists got what they wanted and lost what they feared. Reed maintained his status as a godfather of punk, his influence acknowledged by everyone who came after. But he had to share that throne with others, had to accept that his wasn't the only voice that mattered. Smith achieved the recognition and respect she deserved, proved her talent beyond any doubt, but she also inherited the burden of being an elder statesman, of being the establishment for younger artists to rebel against. The wheel keeps turning. The conflicts repeat. The bathroom hallways of the world keep hosting confrontations between generations, between visions, between artists who all want the same thing: to matter, to be heard, to leave something behind that proves they were here, and they were real. Lou Reed died in 2013, and Patti Smith spoke at his memorial service, her voice breaking as she remembered the complicated, brilliant man behind the legend. She told stories about their early encounters, about the debt she owed him. She didn't mention the CBGB fight, but everyone who knew the story heard its echo in her words, in her acknowledgement that love and anger, admiration and resentment can all coexist in our feelings about the artists who shape us. The story of Lou Reed and Patti Smith is ultimately about the necessary violence of artistic evolution, about how every generation must metaphorically kill its fathers to create space for something new. That bathroom hallway at CBGB witnessed pure, unfiltered truth between two artists who both wanted to change the world. The fight was real, the hurt was real, but so was the respect, buried under layers of defensiveness and fear, waiting 20 years to be acknowledged. That's the real story of punk rock, the complex web of human relationships underneath the rebellion and the noise, the love and hate that binds artists together even as they fight for their space to breathe.